6 months had passed since that day in a lawyer's office. The leaves were changing color now, painting the neighborhood in shades of red and gold. He sat on his back porch, coffee in hand, reflecting on how much had changed and how much he had learned. The divorce had been finalized last week. In the end, everything was settled fairly, though not the way his wife had originally planned. The money she'd taken from their joint account had been returned within days of the confrontation. The items she'd secretly moved out of the house were documented and divided legally. Her mother had even sent him an unexpected letter of apology. His phone buzzed with a notification from his bank. Another automatic investment transfer had gone through. He smiled, thinking about how his habit of financial planning had saved him, but it wasn't just about the money anymore. The whole experience had taught him valuable lessons about trust, preparation, and the importance of staying true to yourself. The house felt different now. He'd redecorated, not to erase memories, but to create a new space for his new life. The empty closet was filled again, this time with just his things. The kitchen had new appliances to replace what she'd taken. Even his home office had been reorganized, though he'd kept the security systems. Some habits were worth keeping. His lawyer friend called occasionally to check on him. During their last conversation, they discussed how the case had already helped others. Word had spread through the legal community about how digital evidence had turned the tables. Now his lawyer was giving seminars about the importance of documenting electronic trails in modern divorce cases. The most surprising change had come at work. After word got out about how he'd handled his situation, several colleagues had approached him for advice. Not just about marriage or finances, but about protecting themselves in all aspects of life. He'd started keeping a list of tips, which eventually grew into something bigger. Opening his laptop, he looked at the document he'd been working on for the past few months. What had started as personal notes had evolved into a comprehensive guide about financial security and relationship wisdom. He titled it Protecting Your Future, Lessons Learned from a Joint Account Story. The guide wasn't about revenge or bitterness. Instead, it focused on practical advice. The importance of maintaining individual financial identity, how to protect digital assets, why communication matters in relationships, and how to prepare for unexpected life changes. He'd been surprised by how writing it had helped him process everything that had happened. His phone rang. It was his sister. She'd been his rock through everything, and now she had news. The local community center where she volunteered wanted him to give a talk about financial literacy and protecting personal assets. At first he hesitated, but then realized his story might help others avoid similar situations. Standing up to stretch, he walked through his garden. The vegetables he planted in spring were ready for harvest, another new hobby he picked up during his recovery. It felt good to create something, to nurture growth, to see tangible results of care and attention. A message popped up on his phone from one of his support group friends. They'd met through an online forum for people going through similar situations. What started as a place to share pain had become a network of healing and growth. They helped each other navigate the complicated emotions of betrayal and recovery. Inside, he opened his safe, the same one where he'd kept his separate account documents. Now it held different papers, his final divorce decree, the deed to his house in just his name, and the outline for his upcoming community center talk. Each paper represented not just an ending, but a new beginning. His coffee had gone cold, but he hardly noticed. He was too busy thinking about the future. Next week, he'd start teaching that financial literacy class at the community center. The week after, he had a meeting with a publisher interested in his guide. Life was moving forward in unexpected ways. The doorbell rang, his neighbor dropping off some homemade bread. She was elderly and had taken to checking on him after learning about his divorce. "You're doing better," she said, noting his smile. "Much better," he agreed, and meant it. Standing by the window, watching them leave the building, he felt strangely empty. He'd won, but victory tasted bittersweet. His lawyer patted his shoulder. "You did the right thing," he said. "Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting someone face the consequences of their own actions." The law office lobby felt unusually quiet that morning. He sat there, watching sunlight stream through the tall windows, waiting for the meeting that would change everything. His lawyer stood nearby, reviewing their documents one final time. They'd chosen this location for the confrontation, neutral ground, but on their terms. At exactly 10 a.m., the elevator doors opened. His wife walked in, head held high, followed by her lawyer and her mother. The confidence in her stride showed she still thought she had the upper hand. She barely glanced his way as they were led into the conference room, its large oak table creating a barrier between the two sides. "Let's keep this simple," her lawyer began, pulling out a folder. "My client is willing to be reasonable about the division of remaining assets." The way he emphasized remaining made it clear they thought they were in control of the situation. His wife sat there with a slight smile, probably thinking about the emptied bank account. His lawyer cleared his throat. "Before we discuss any terms, we have some information to share." He began laying out documents on the table, one by one. Bank statements, security logs, email records. With each new piece of evidence, his wife's smile faded slightly. "What's all this?" her lawyer asked, picking up one of the papers. His own lawyer smiled. "Let's start with the unauthorized access of financial accounts." He played the security camera footage showing her photographing bank statements and passwords while he slept. Her face paled slightly. Next came the network logs showing her late-night financial transfers and secret email correspondences. "As you can see," his lawyer continued, "we have documented every step of this premeditated plan." Her mother shifted uncomfortably in her chair as they showed evidence of her involvement too. The real shock came when his lawyer revealed the separate account statements. "My client has maintained a private investment account for years," he explained, sliding the documents across the table. "All legally obtained and properly reported on tax returns." The numbers made his wife's eyes widen. The joint account she'd emptied was merely a drop in the ocean. Her lawyer leaned over to whisper something in her ear, but she wasn't listening. She was staring at the account statements, the color draining from her face as she realized what she'd done and what she'd left behind. "We're prepared to file these documents with the court this afternoon," his lawyer continued, "including evidence of financial fraud, unauthorized access of accounts, and conspiracy to hide assets." The legal terms hung heavy in the air. Her mother reached for her water glass with shaking hands. His wife finally spoke, her voice less confident now. "You've been hiding money from me all this time," she accused, trying to shift the focus. His lawyer was ready for this. "My client maintained a legal, properly reported separate account, which is very different from secretly emptying joint accounts and hiding assets." The meeting continued as they laid out their terms. The money she'd taken would need to be returned immediately. All hidden assets would need to be disclosed. Any attempt to contest would result in criminal charges for financial fraud. Her lawyer asked for a brief recess to consult with his client. As they left the room, he could see his wife's hands trembling as she clutched her designer handbag, probably bought with money from their joint account. When they returned 15 minutes later, the change in her demeanor was striking. Gone was the confident woman who'd walked in earlier. She sat down heavily in her chair, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Her lawyer spoke first. "My client is willing to return the funds from the joint account." He paused, glancing at her. "And to provide a full accounting of all assets removed from the home." His own lawyer nodded. "That's a start. We'll also need," and he began listing their other requirements. Each point was met with quiet acceptance from the other side. The power had shifted completely. As the meeting wound down, he finally spoke directly to his wife. "I trusted you for 12 years, he said quietly. "All you had to do was talk to me." She looked up briefly, then back down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. The final documents were prepared right there. Agreements for the return of funds, full disclosure of assets, and terms for the divorce proceedings. As she signed each page, her hand trembling slightly, he felt no joy, only a sad recognition that sometimes winning feels a lot like losing. They left separately, her mother hurrying her toward the elevator while her lawyer stayed behind to handle the paperwork. As the elevator doors closed on his wife's defeated expression, he realized that the clever plan she'd worked on for months had unraveled in less than 2 hours. Tomorrow would change everything. While she thought she had executed the perfect plan, she was about to learn that sometimes the cleverest plans are the ones that backfire the most spectacularly. As he walked into his quiet house, he allowed himself a small smile. The real game was just beginning. The next morning arrived with a sense of purpose. He barely slept, but adrenaline kept him sharp as he walked into his lawyer's office, clutching a thick folder of documents. The morning sun cast long shadows through the office windows as they began preparing their legal strategy. "Let's go through everything one more time," his lawyer said, spreading papers across the mahogany conference table. They had assembled an impressive collection of evidence: bank statements, digital logs, security camera footage, and detailed records of every suspicious transaction over the past 3 months. The legal team had worked through the night, preparing motions and documents that would stop his wife's financial maneuvers in their tracks. Each piece of evidence told part of the story: the late-night bank transfers, the secret meetings with her own lawyers, the gradual movement of assets. "Look at this," his lawyer pointed to a particularly interesting transaction. "She tried to be clever by making multiple smaller transfers instead of one large withdrawal." They had traced each transfer, creating a clear pattern of premeditated financial deception. The bank's fraud department had already flagged several of these transactions as suspicious. His phone buzzed, a message from her lawyer requesting a meeting to discuss terms. He showed it to his lawyer, who smiled knowingly. "They think they're in control. Let them keep thinking that for now." They spent the next hour preparing for the upcoming confrontation. His lawyer advised him on what to say and, more importantly, what not to say. "Let the evidence speak for itself," was the constant reminder. They knew she would try to paint herself as the victim, claiming she took only what she deserved. Around noon, another email arrived from her lawyer, this one with a more demanding tone. They wanted to settle quickly, probably hoping to finalize everything before the full extent of her actions came to light. His lawyer drafted a careful response, agreeing to meet, but on their terms and timeline. The afternoon was spent gathering additional evidence. His ape background proved invaluable as they documented every digital footprint she'd left behind. Each login, each password change, each file download, it all painted a picture of calculated deception. "People often forget about digital evidence," his lawyer commented, reviewing the logs. "They think deleting files or clearing browser history is enough, but data never really disappears." They had recovered deleted emails discussing her plans with her mother, text messages coordinating with movers, and even searches for how to hide money from your spouse. As they worked, his lawyer shared stories of similar cases, but none where the evidence was quite so comprehensive. "Most people don't have your technical expertise," he explained. "You've given us everything we need to prove premeditation and malicious intent." The most damning evidence came from the home security system. They had footage of her secretly packing things away while he was at work, meeting with unknown individuals in their home, and making late-night phone calls in the garage. All of it time-stamped and documented. By late afternoon, they had assembled a complete timeline of events. It started 3 months ago with her first consultation with a divorce lawyer and ended with her early morning raid on their joint account. Every step she'd taken thinking she was being careful had actually left another piece of evidence. "Look at these credit card statements," his lawyer pointed out. "She's been booking hotel rooms in advance, planning this for weeks." They had found charges for a storage unit too, rented under her mother's name, but paid for with their joint credit card. The sun was setting when they finally finished preparing their legal response. It would be filed first thing in the morning. A comprehensive counterattack that would expose every aspect of her scheme. The documents included motions for emergency injunctions to freeze assets, demands for full financial disclosure, and evidence of her premeditated financial deception. His lawyer leaned back in his chair, satisfied with their day's work. "She thought she was pulling off the perfect plan," he said, "but she didn't realize she was leaving evidence everywhere she turned." They had built an airtight case that would be hard to defend against. Before leaving the office, they received one final email from her lawyer. Another attempt to pressure them into a quick settlement. His lawyer drafted a short, professional response. "We'll be happy to discuss terms after tomorrow morning's court filing." Driving home in the evening traffic, he felt a strange mix of emotions. There was sadness for the end of his marriage, but also a sense of satisfaction knowing that justice would be served. His wife had tried to play a game of deception, but she'd chosen the wrong opponent. The revelation of his separate account wouldn't just change the divorce proceedings, it would completely shift the power dynamic. His wife thought she'd left him financially crippled, but she was about to learn a hard lesson about assumptions and underestimation. As night fell, he made himself a simple dinner in the kitchen that still felt too empty. Tomorrow would be a big day. His wife had tried to play a game of financial chess, thinking she was the queen making the final move, but she hadn't realized she was playing against a grandmaster who'd been thinking 10 steps ahead all along. Setting his alarm for early morning, he felt strangely at peace. Sometimes the best defense isn't just having a plan, it's having a plan so good that your opponent's attack becomes their own undoing. The meeting with his lawyer friend stretched late into the afternoon. As they reviewed the digital evidence, his friend's expression grew increasingly confident. She thought she was being smart, his friend said, shuffling through the printouts. But she didn't know who she was dealing with. Back home, sitting in his study, he opened his laptop one more time. His wife's dramatic exit had played right into his hands, though she didn't know it yet. You see, there was something she'd completely overlooked, something that would turn her perfect plan upside down. Years ago, when they'd first started making good money, he'd opened a separate account. Not because he didn't trust her, but because his parents had taught him to always have a backup plan. It's not about trust, his father had said. It's about being prepared for anything. Those words rang truer now than ever before. This wasn't just any regular savings account. He'd been quietly transferring a portion of his salary there for years, investing it wisely in a mix of stocks and bonds. While their joint account had seemed impressive with its $70,000 balance, it was just the tip of the iceberg. His private account had grown to over 10 times that amount. He pulled up the account dashboard, checking the balance one more time. The numbers made him smile, not out of greed, but out of relief. While his wife had been plotting her grand theft, thinking she was securing her future, she'd been looking at only a small fraction of their actual wealth. Opening his email, he found a fresh message from his investment advisor. The quarterly report showed his portfolio had grown another 12% in the past 3 months. The very same 3 months his wife had spent planning her exit, he'd been unknowingly building an even stronger financial fortress. He remembered the day he'd started this account. It was after watching his cousin go through a nasty divorce, losing almost everything because he'd kept all his money in joint accounts. Always have a backup plan, his cousin had warned him. At the time, it had seemed almost paranoid. Now it felt like destiny. The irony wasn't lost on him. His wife had probably spent countless hours calculating exactly how much she could take from their joint account without triggering any immediate red flags. She'd timed her transfers perfectly, thinking she was leaving him financially stranded. But in reality, she'd only grabbed the bait, leaving the real treasure untouched. Standing up, he walked to the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. In their 12 years of marriage, he'd never once mentioned this account to her. Not because he was being deceitful, but because he believed in being prepared for any situation. It was the same reason he kept emergency supplies in the basement and extra cables for all their devices. His phone buzzed, another message from his lawyer friend. Everything's ready for tomorrow. She won't know what hit her. He replied with a quick thumbs-up emoji, his mind already racing ahead to the next day's proceedings. Turning back to his laptop, he started preparing the documents they'd need. Bank statements showing his separate accounts' growth over the years. Investment reports demonstrating his careful planning and financial responsibility. Tax records proving every penny was legally earned and properly reported. He thought about his wife, probably feeling victorious right now, thinking she'd pulled off the perfect escape. She'd be sitting somewhere, maybe in a hotel room or at her mother's house, counting her spoils and planning her new life. The thought didn't make him angry anymore, it made him sad. She'd thrown away 12 years of marriage for what she thought was a clever financial grab, not knowing she actually left behind the real wealth. Opening his safe, he pulled out a folder he'd kept for years. Inside were all the original documents related to his private account, the initial paperwork, investment strategies, everything. He'd always been methodical about keeping records, another habit that was about to pay off big time. His lawyer had been clear about the next steps. They'd file everything first thing in the morning, including a complete disclosure of all assets, including his private account. The law required full financial transparency in divorce proceedings, and he had nothing to hide. In fact, he was looking forward to being completely honest about his finances. As he walked to his car, laptop bag heavy with evidence, he felt a strange mix of sadness and determination. The woman he loved had tried to destroy him financially, but she'd done it in his domain. Now it was his turn to show her just how much she'd underestimated him. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even, it's about revealing the truth. Sitting in front of his computer, he cracked his knuckles and took a deep breath. This was his world: ones and zeros, digital footprints, and data trails. While his wife might have thought she'd pulled off the perfect disappearing act, she'd forgotten one crucial detail: she was married to an AT security specialist. He started with their home network logs. Every device that connected to their Wi-Fi left a trace, like breadcrumbs in a digital forest. Opening his network monitoring software, he scrolled through weeks of data. There it was, late-night connections from her phone, usually between 1 and 3 a.m. when she thought he was asleep. The timestamps matched perfectly with those working late nights. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he dove deeper. Their shared cloud storage account showed interesting patterns too. Files had been downloaded in bulk over the past month: financial documents, property papers, insurance policies. She'd been thorough, he had to give her that. But she'd forgotten to clear the access logs. The real goldmine came from their smart home system. Every time a door opened or closed, every time someone entered or left the house, it was all recorded. He pulled up the logs from the past 2 months. While he was at work, there were multiple entries during odd hours. The garage door opening at 11 a.m. on a Tuesday. The front door at 2 p.m. on a Thursday. Times when she was supposedly at her office. Their security cameras told an even more interesting story. He watched footage of her carrying boxes to her car in the middle of the day, piece by piece, week after week. The timestamp on one video showed her letting someone in through the back door. A man he'd never seen before, probably her lawyer, given the briefcase and formal attire. His heart sank as he watched these betrayals play out on his screen, but his professional instincts kept him focused. This wasn't just about catching her anymore, it was about protecting himself. He downloaded everything, creating secure backups of all the evidence. The bank notifications from this morning weren't the whole story either. Logging into their online banking portal, he traced back months of transactions. Small transfers at first, barely noticeable amounts moving to an unknown account. They gradually grew larger, more frequent. She'd been building her escaped fund right under his nose, testing the waters to see if he'd notice. His email archives revealed more surprises. Their shared family email account showed correspondence with moving companies, storage facilities, and, this one making pause, a divorce lawyer. The consultations had started 3 months ago. The email timestamps matched perfectly with those work calls she'd been taking in the garage. Opening another program, he accessed the backup of their home computer. Even deleted files leave traces, and he found plenty. Searches for how to hide money from your spouse, best states for divorce settlements, and how to transfer large sums without raising suspicion. Each search was like a knife in his heart, but also another piece of evidence. Then he found something that made him sit up straighter. In a folder marked Work Projects, he discovered screenshots of his own banking apps. She'd been photographing his phone screen while he slept, capturing passwords and account numbers. The timestamps showed she'd done this multiple times, probably worried she'd missed something important. His hands were shaking now, but not from anger. A plan was forming in his mind. Every digital move she'd made, every calculated step in her grand escape, it was all documented. She thought she'd been clever, covering her tracks in the real world, but she'd left a glaring digital trail. He reached for his phone and made a call. "Hey, can you meet me at your office in an hour? I need legal advice." His old college roommate had become one of the best divorce attorneys in the city. "Bring everything you've got," his friend replied, understanding the urgency in his voice. Before heading out, he made one final check of his security systems. That's when he noticed something odd. A new login attempt on their joint account, probably her checking to make sure her morning transfers had gone through. He smiled slightly. She had no idea that every login, every click, every digital move she made was being recorded. The sun was high in the sky now as he gathered his evidence onto a secure drive. His wife had spent months planning her exit, thinking she'd thought of everything. But in focusing so much on the physical escape, the money, the belongings, the perfectly timed disappearance, she'd overlooked the digital web she'd woven. The betrayal stung, but what hurt more was realizing how long this had been in the making. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision or an emotional breakdown. This was calculated, planned, and executed with precision. Every late night, every suspicious phone call, every sudden interest in their finances, it had all been leading to this moment. As he stood in their kitchen, his kitchen now, holding his coffee mug, a thought struck him. If she had been this methodical in her planning, what else had she done that he hadn't discovered yet? His security background kicked in, and he realized he needed to start thinking like an investigator rather than a heartbroken husband. Setting down his mug, he walked back to his office with renewed purpose. She might think she'd covered all her tracks, but everyone leaves a digital footprint. And if there was one thing he excelled at, it was following digital breadcrumbs. Time to put his skills to use and uncover just how deep this deception really went. As he sat in his home office later that day, surrounded by the remnants of their shared life, memories began flooding back like pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. The signs had been there all along, floating right in front of his eyes, but love had made him blind to what now seemed so obvious. It started 3 months ago during their anniversary dinner. She had been different that night, distant, checking her phone more often than usual. When he'd asked about it, she'd smiled that rehearsed smile he now recognized and said, "Just work stuff, honey. You know how it is." He believed her because, well, why wouldn't he? 12 years of marriage had built a foundation of trust, or so he thought. Then came the sudden interest in their finances. "I've been thinking," she'd said one evening, curled up on their leather couch with her laptop. "Maybe I should take over the banking stuff. You're always so busy with your at work." He'd agreed, touched by what he thought was her consideration for his heavy workload. Now he understood. She'd been studying their accounts, learning their patterns, preparing for her grand exit. The working late excuses started piling up about 6 weeks ago. 3, sometimes 4 nights a week, she'd text that she was stuck at the office. Big project, she'd explain. Deadline coming up. He'd even brought her dinner one night, wanting to surprise her, only to find her office dark and empty. When he'd called, she'd claimed she was in a meeting at a client's office. He'd brushed off the uneasy feeling in his gut, telling himself he was being paranoid. Her phone became her constant companion, always face down when not in use. She'd take calls in the bathroom or garage, voiced hushed. If he walked into the room while she was texting, she'd quickly switch apps to something innocent, weather, news, social media. Once he'd glimpsed a banking app notification before she hurriedly swiped it away. The changes in her behavior were subtle but consistent. She stopped sharing stories about her day. Their evening conversations grew shorter, more superficial. When he'd try to discuss their future plans, the vacation they'd been saving for, the house renovation they'd dreamed about, she'd change the subject or find an excuse to leave the room. Last week, she'd insisted on organizing their home office. "It's so cluttered in here," she'd said, spending hours going through their filing cabinet. He now realized she'd been gathering account numbers, passwords, anything she needed for her plan. She'd even asked him to write down the passwords to their joint accounts, claiming she kept forgetting them. "It's easier if I have them all in one place," she'd said with that same practiced smile. The most painful memory was from just 2 days ago. They'd had breakfast together like any other morning. She'd made his favorite omelette, asked about his upcoming work projects, and kissed him goodbye as he left for work. She'd seemed so normal, so present. Had she already known it would be their last breakfast together? Had she sat there, sharing coffee and conversation, knowing she was about to destroy everything they'd built? Standing up from his desk, he walked to their bedroom and opened his nightstand drawer. Inside was the birthday card she'd given him just last month. The message inside read, "To many more years of love and adventure together." He'd been so moved by those words at the time. Now they felt like another calculated move in her elaborate deception. His hand brushed against something else in the drawer, a small velvet box containing the anniversary gift he'd been saving for their upcoming celebration. A vintage watch she'd admired months ago. He'd spent weeks tracking down the exact model, planning to surprise her. The irony wasn't lost on him. Moving to the kitchen, he noticed more signs of her methodical exit. The expensive kitchen knife set his mother had given them for Christmas, gone. Their shared photo albums, missing. Even their wedding album had vanished, along with most of their important documents. She'd been slowly erasing herself from their home, piece by piece, while he went about his daily life, oblivious to the dismantling of their marriage. The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the bedroom curtains when his phone started buzzing like crazy. He tried to ignore it at first, rolling over and pulling the pillow over his head. But the notifications kept coming, one after another, like an annoying alarm clock that wouldn't shut up. What's so important at 6:30 in the morning? He mumbled, finally reaching for his phone. As his eyes adjusted to the bright screen, his heart stopped. There were at least 15 notifications from his bank, each one more alarming than the last. Transaction approved, $25,000. Transaction approved, $15,000. Transaction approved, $30,000. His fingers trembled as he quickly opened his banking app. The balance that should have shown well over $70,000 now displayed a measly $152.47. He sat up so fast his head spun, fully awake now, his heart pounding in his chest. "Hey, are you awake?" he called out, his voice echoing through the unusually quiet house. No response. He jumped out of bed, his bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor as he rushed to her side of the bed. The covers were perfectly made. She hadn't slept there last night. Running to their walk-in closet, he flicked on the lights. Her side was empty. Not just a few missing clothes for a trip, but completely cleared out. Every dress, every shoe, every handbag, gone. Even her favorite perfume bottle that always sat on her dresser had vanished. The only things left were a few empty hangers swaying gently in the air from his sudden entrance. He stood there, trying to make sense of it all, when his eyes caught something unusual. There, on her dresser, was her house key and a folded piece of paper. His hands were shaking as he picked up the note. The handwriting was rushed, but he recognized it immediately. "I'm sorry it had to end this way, but I couldn't take it anymore. Don't try to find me. By the time you read this, I'll be long gone. I've taken what I deserve from our account. Consider it my parting gift." He slumped down onto the ottoman in the closet, the note crumpling in his grip. 12 years of marriage, and this was how she chose to end it? No discussion, no warning, just an empty closet and an even emptier bank account. His phone buzzed again, making him jump. This time it was a text from his mother-in-law. "I hope you understand why she had to do this. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." So her mother knew. They had planned this together. His mind raced back through the past few weeks, looking for signs he might have missed. The late-night phone calls she said were work-related. The sudden interest in their financial paperwork. The way she insisted on handling the banking to take some burden off his shoulders. He walked to the kitchen in a daze, desperately needing coffee to help him think clearly. That's when he noticed more missing items: the expensive coffee maker they'd bought last Christmas, the set of premium knives he'd given her for her birthday, even the fancy air fryer they'd barely used. She'd clearly been planning this for a while, slowly moving things up when he wasn't paying attention. Sitting at his kitchen counter, he pulled out his laptop. He needed to take action, but his mind was swimming. Should he call the police? A lawyer? The bank? As he stared at his laptop screen, a small smile started to form on his lips. There was something his wife didn't know, something that would turn her clever plan completely upside down. He opened his work folder and started typing. As an IT security specialist, he had access to tools and information that most people didn't even know existed. And his wife, in her rush to empty their accounts, had forgotten one crucial detail about who she was dealing with. This wasn't going to end the way she planned, not by a long shot. The sun was now fully up, casting a warm glow through the kitchen windows. He took a deep breath and cracked his knuckles. Time to show her that she wasn't the only one who could be clever.